Welcome to the story of George Prime as seen through newspaper articles and ads. Most of the content in this presentation can be found in the archives of the Sarasota County History Center. Mrs. Amelia Ballard Prime was born in Stratford, Connecticut in 1841. Mr. and Mrs. Prime and her brother, Dr. C.W. Ballard, and wife moved from Stratford to Albert Lea, Minnesota about 1878, where Mrs. Prime gave birth to a baby boy, George Ballard Prime, on December 12th of 1880. The story of Sarasota has the Primes and Ballards coming down to Bradentown, today's Bradenton, in Manatee County by the winter of 1885 to 1886, in time for the freak snowfall recorded at that time. Master George was 5 years old. Dr. Ballard was a dentist. The Primes and Ballards were snowbirds until 1890, going back to Minnesota every summer. George's father must have passed away between 1886 and 1889 because the newspapers reported Mrs. M.A. Prime as a widow by 1889. Mrs. M.A. Millie or Amelia Prime loved to travel and took her son George with her everywhere. A good number of the trips were by boat up and down the Gulf Coast. The strong bond between mother and son lasted the rest of her life. The sailing trips engendered a love for boating, and George owned his first boat, the yacht Ruth, at age 15. When he was 16, he went on a turtle hunt at a Gulf beach with several others. George brought back a live turtle measuring a yard in length. On that trip, 5 turtles were turned and 900 turtle eggs secured. Most of the rest of his life, he loved hunting game throughout Florida. By the way, turned means that a turtle is put on its back where it is helpless, and the hunters return later to harvest the turtle meat. George went to school in Bradentown, again today's Bradenton, and spent the spring semester in 1898 at Rollins College at Winter Park, Florida. After spending the summer with his mother in Georgia, George, age 17, accepted a position with Corsi, Blakely and Company, ready to learn the mercantile trade. Mrs. Prime settled down and bought Captain Muller's home on Prospect Avenue. This is a typical mercantile store around 1900, the Hubbard store in Bradentown. A few months later, March of 1899, at age 18, George decided he didn't want to work for someone else. It appears he convinced his mother to help him financially to set up his own clothing and material store in Bradentown, albeit with a young partner, Clifford McGinty. That partnership advertised but didn't seem to gain a solid customer base, and in about 2 months was dissolved. The reason given was that Mr. McGinty was retiring from the business. He, in fact, started a business on the Bradentown wharf. Prime continued by himself. George's age probably played a part in his short-term business relationships. He probably also wanted to be in charge. At the young age of 18, on September 13th of 1899, George Ballard Prime married Miss Kate Blount in Bartow, Florida. The portion of the article says, "were to be married," refers to the outbreak of yellow fever in parts of Florida and whether George made it to the wedding on time because of quarantine limitations. Kate Blount was the daughter of one of the founders of Bartow, Judge Benjamin Blount. One of his other daughters married the editor of the Manatee River Journal, the newspaper I have referenced. Mr. and Mrs. J. H. Humphreys also lived in Bradentown. Partly because the sisters were close and lived in the same town, the Primes were referenced in the paper often. Kate was 1 year older than George and probably somewhat of a stabilizing factor. At the end of this presentation, I will be talking more about Mrs. Kate Prime and some of her achievements. George's business venture did not seem to be a moneymaker. The ads seemed to get smaller and smaller, and he was looking for other ways to make money, like selling or chartering his boat, the sloop Thekla. George made time to go sailing. He spent part of a week on Sarasota Bay looking after his mother's orange grove in November of 1899 and cruised down the coast for a week or more in February and April of 1900. In April, he closed his business and moved to Sarasota with his wife and mother. Mrs. M.A. Prime swapped houses temporarily with Mrs. Edmondson from Sarasota and moved into the Gulf Stream residence in May. Corsi, Blakely and Company, the Bradentown business that George Prime worked for, had interests in expanding down to Sarasota. They set up a store in Sarasota in August of 1898 with S.H. Highsmith, their business partner, as manager. The following October, they bought out George A. Kaysen, the largest merchant in Sarasota, at the old Florida Mortgage and Investment Company store, and moved in. However, things changed, and George A. Kaysen bought back the business the following January. W.B. Corsi tried again to expand into Sarasota in May of 1899 by buying Harry Heigl's mercantile business at the corner of 5 Points with J.B. Turner and leasing the building, forming the company Corsi, Turner and Company. S.H. Highsmith was a minority partner in both Corsi, Blakely and Company in Bradentown and Corsi, Turner and Company in Sarasota. In April 1900, Corsi, Turner and Company, including S.H. Highsmith, bought the old Whitaker store building down Lower Main Street and started building an addition to the building, and in June the two Corsi companies dissolved and reformed as W.B. Corsi and Company in Bradentown and Highsmith Corsi and Prime in Sarasota. Shortly thereafter, J.B. Turner buys out W.B. Corsi, and the firm becomes Highsmith, Turner and Prime. George Prime's experience as a merchant in Sarasota was different than his previous experience. In Bradentown, merchants dealt in cash and sometimes short-term credit. The Story of Sarasota by Carl Grismer gave this account of his Sarasota business. "We did a mighty good business, but very little of it was for cash," says Prime. "One year we sold $100,000 worth of goods without receiving $1,000 in cash over the counters. The principal mediums of exchange were alligator hides, cow hides, furs, sweet potatoes, chickens, and produce of all kinds. We shipped all this stuff by boat to market and received what we could in cash." By October 1900, less than 4 months later, George figured out what he really wanted to do. He could use his boat to take the products the stores took in, trade, and sail to markets like Tampa and Key West to sell them. He sold his interest in the company to E.T. Blakely and spent the next 7 years sailing to different markets. During the 7 years George sailed the Gulf Coast, the Primes were blessed with the births of 3 children, Anne, or Annie Ballard, on July 25th of 1901, Catherine Amelia on September 13th of 1903, and George Ben Jr. on September 26th of 1905. George had his schooner Catherine rebuilt to a larger 10-ton vessel in 1902 and then added a 10-horsepower gas engine in 1904, both at the Fogarty's shipyard. In 1903, George also owned a sloop, the Rover. In 1901, Mrs. M.A. Prime sold her Prospect Avenue home in Bradentown to F.R. Weber, the father-in-law of J.H. Lord, and had a house built in Sarasota for which George delivered part of the lumber. 1906, the disappearance of the Vandalia. From the Tampa Daily Times on Tuesday, May 30th, 1906. The disappearance of the schooner Vandalia, owned by Captain Will Fogarty of Manatee County, is causing great concern among Captain Fogarty's friends in Tampa and Manatee County, and especially to his mother. Mrs. Fogarty, who has been in the city several days this morning, chartered Captain John Miller's yacht, the Tarpon, to cruise along the Gulf Coast in the hope of finding the missing schooner, in which Captain Fogarty and his crew left Key West more than 20 days ago, and the vessel leaves at once on that mission. Captain Miller will accompany Captain Quinn and the crew of the Tarpon on the trip. It is feared that Captain Fogarty and his crew have been lost, although it is possible that they have put in some sheltered bay for repairs. Manatee River Journal, June 8th. The missing schooner Vandalia, owned and sailed by Captain W.S. Fogarty, bound from Key West to Bradentown, has at last been found, capsized and abandoned 5 miles off Cape Romano, in 3 fathoms of water. The fate of Captain Fogarty and his crew of 4 men is still unknown, but the hope is held out that they may have been picked up by an outbound ship, or that they managed to reach some key out of the usual track of vessels. The schooner was found by Captain John Miller with the yacht Tarpon, who had been sent out by Captain Fogarty's family to search for the missing vessel and her crew, but no clue as to the details of the disaster could be discovered. On May 6th, the Vandalia left Key West for this port, and as heavy northeast winds were then blowing, some time elapsed after the date of her expected arrival without causing any anxiety. But as the days ran into weeks with no tidings from Captain Fogarty, his family and friends began to fear for his safety, and the Tarpon was chartered to search for him with the result stated. Captain Fogarty is the only son of Mrs. Eliza M. and the late Captain William Fogarty, and his maternal grandmother was Mrs. Asrath, better known as Madam Joe, one of the earliest and most celebrated pioneers of Manatee County. He comes from a long line of sailors and is himself an expert seaman and swimmer. In his immediate family are his wife and 4 children and his mother, who reside in Fogartyville, besides which he is closely connected to all of the Fogarty families in this community. His schooner, the Vandalia, was built under his personal supervision of the very best material and was launched about 7 years ago. She was a staunch vessel of 45 tons and well adapted for the coasting trade in which she was engaged. To the superstitious, her career was begun under an unlucky star, for which she was launched. She ran over and killed a black workman, who could not get out of the way, so this makes her second and maybe final disaster. It is understood that Captain S.S. Fogarty will attempt the salvage of the Vandalia, and the necessary equipment is being secured in Tampa. One of Vandalia's nameplates was secured by Captain Miller and forwarded here. Manatee River Journal, July 13th. The wreck of the Vandalia, owned and run by lamented Captain W.J. Fogarty, was towed into Fogartyville last Friday in charge of Captain George Prime and turned over to Mrs. Fogarty. On 2 previous trips to Key West, Captain Prime passed by the ill-fated vessel as she lay a wreck, and believing he could restore her, was sent on that mission on June 26, sailing with his schooner the Letty and the launch Arrow. Reaching Punta Rasa, he learned that one of Captain Towns' cattle boats had towed her to that port, and in response to a wire, Mrs. Fogarty went to Myers and secured the boat from Captain Towns, and left her in charge of Captain Prime, who had her pumped, caulked, and otherwise put in readiness for the homeward voyage. On leaving Punta Rasa with the Vandalia in tow, Captain Prime wired Captain Harry Quinn of the Mermaid in Tampa to come to his assistance. The Mermaid and the Letty met at Boca Grande, and together they arrived with the Vandalia on Friday. There were no signs of any bodies aboard, and very few of the boat's belongings, she having been divested of nearly all of her rigging, anchors, etc. There was quite an accumulation of sand in the bottom of the boat, and as she lay anchored at the home dock, 2 of the little fatherless boys were digging in the sand and found their papa's watch, 2 chains, his Masonic pin, and some other trinkets, all of which they prize very highly. While George was away, for a few years the firm of Highsmith, Turner and Company, Blakely having a minority interest, did a thriving business carrying the largest stock of merchandise in the county and building a couple of warehouses for their grain and feed, and then seeing the need of a drug store, put up a building adjoining, put in a good stock of drugs, which after 6 months they sold to the Fred Knight's drug store, who continued at the same stand. Wishing to branch out and add millinery, a building was put up on the other side. The dry goods, shoes, and notions were transferred and millinery parlors opened. About 1907, Highsmith, Turner and Company bought out E.T. Blakely. Then a little while later, George Prime bought an interest and the company split. J.B. Turner took over the dry goods department, and Highsmith and Prime retained the groceries, furniture, feed, etc. A full line of caskets was then carried, and they extended the hardware department. Fred Knight's drug store, in addition to the old Whitaker store building. In 1910, when Fred Knight's drugstore was bought by the Sarasota Drug Company and moved up the street, they used the vacant store to lay in a complete line, including sporting goods. The businesses in the area agreed to summer business hours from May through September, closing at 6 p.m., and on Thursday they closed by 1 p.m. Highsmith and Prime went along with those hours. In 1910, George Prime, at age 29, had a wife, 3 children, 2 dogs, and an established business. He would enjoy hunting and fishing, camping often with his family. In August, the town council voted Prime as a temporary treasurer. In 1911, he built a cottage on Palm Avenue and moved the family in. Business at Highsmith and Prime was doing well, and in August, the slow time, they had to add another delivery wagon. In May of 1912, Highsmith and Prime incorporated under the name Highsmith, Prime and Company, taking in as a member of the firm E.J. Bright, who had been with them for several years. A large brick warehouse was built in back, and an undertaking department conducted on the second floor of the warehouse under the management of G.L. Thacker, now a licensed embalmer. On February 9th of 1912, the Primes were blessed with the birth of another daughter, Rose Brooks Prime. During November 1912, Mr. Bright and Mr. George B. Prime spent time in Tampa, where Mr. Bright had the necessary papers made out in the United States court, making him a naturalized American citizen. Mr. Bright has been in this country from England for several years, but had not applied for citizenship. December 1912. Kennedy and Thompson bought the furniture part of the business from Highsmith Prime & Company and moved into the wooden building on Main and Lemon across from the new Worth brick building. In January of 1913, Highsmith Prime & Company sold part of their property on Main Street to the Sarasota Improvement Company, who built a two-story 40 by 100 foot brick block, of which the first floor was leased by Highsmith Prime & Company for 3 years to house their grocery business. The old Whitaker store building, the addition, and the warehouse were not part of this deal. At the same time, G.L. Thacker had purchased their undertaking business, opening up a display room in the warehouse. March 6 had the first Yellow Kid advertisement for Highsmith Prime & Company. In April, Prime moved his house on Palm next to his mother's house on Gulfstream. In June of 1913, the company installed an up-to-date gasoline station in front of their store. In June, the grocery department moved into the new Caples building on the first floor. They put in a refrigerator showcase for fruit and had the front window screened for vegetables. Prime was appointed a member of the Ways and Means Committee for the Sarasota Board of Trade, and Highsmith Prime & Company joined the Business Men's Association. The Women's Club hosted a cotylene shortening cake contest in September at Highsmith Prime & Company, with Mrs. E.A. Cartack, the dentist's wife, winning the contest. In November, George was voted a director in the Board of Trade. The Highsmith Prime & Company Yellow Kid advertising was derived from the cartoon made popular at the turn of the century. The Yellow Kid was not a comic strip. Except for a few multi-panel episodes near its end, it was always a large single-image genre cartoon. But the cartoon's massive popularity made the colored funny section a necessity in every major Sunday newspaper in America. When R.F. Outcault licensed his own characters, he often drew the images himself and eventually arranged the licenses through his advertising agency, which was based in Chicago and managed by his son. The licensed ad would start out with a drawing and some words about hardware, and then let the licensee put in their own words below. At the end of May 1914, you could sense that Highsmith Prime & Company was going to make a change. The advertising had two styles in the same ad, one portion for hardware and the other for groceries. Sure enough, a week later, George Prime took the hardware side of the business and separated from S.H. Highsmith and E.J. Bright, which then operated the grocery-only business. Note, the actual dissolution of Highsmith Prime & Company happened on November 10, 1915, by Judge O.K. Reeves, son of the Fruitville pioneer C.L. Reeves. In September, it was reported that Mrs. George B. Prime had the misfortune to break her arm while cranking the auto. During the same month, George, as part of the Good Roads men, traveled through Central Florida, determining the best road types for Sarasota. George used the Yellow Kid ads, almost a new one every week, until March of 1915, when he introduced a dog named Tiggy. In September of 1915, J.L. Iverson was finishing up his third Iverson block, a 50 by 60-foot concrete building next to the other two Iverson blocks on Lower Main Street, where Dr. Wallace's house was located. A glass front was installed in preparation of George Prime moving his hardware store to the building in October. There was a 20 by 40-foot warehouse behind the building and a 3,800 square foot of display space. At this time, Prime had 3 clerks and an auto delivery service. GB Prime Hardware Store on Lower Main Street, circa 1916. The Iverson building that housed Prime's hardware business was redesigned by Thomas Reed Martin with an Art Deco slipcover architecture in 1926 called the Alcazar. It is currently Melvin's Restaurant. The Tiggy advertisement stemmed from the cartoon strip Buster Brown and his dog Tiggy. Richard Outcault also licensed out this line of advertisement. In 1911, W.B. Corsi, who George had worked for, used the full Buster Brown cartoon in his ads in Bradentown. This ad included Buster Brown and Tiggy and Buster's girlfriend, Mary Jane, who was modeled after Outcault's own daughter. This may be where Prime got the idea about using licensed ads. Tiggy ads lasted from March of 1915 to April of 1917, when the Billy Bear ads took over. At the end of 1970, George Prime ran for political office, the council seat for the 3rd Ward. The Sarasota Times claimed that George stated, "He had no campaign manager, but that he has had right good luck hunting this year, and took that as an omen that he would be successful in his political aspirations, and that he was opposed to so many meetings of the council at this time of year as it interfered with his hunting." On the 24th of November 1918, the Primes were blessed with another daughter, Alice Elizabeth. In this ad, we see the name of the company, at least in the ads, changed from George B. Prime to GB Prime Hardware Company, but more often George B. Prime Hardware Company. At this time, he was selling Dort cars as well as hardware. George's store was robbed in January of 1919, about 3 a.m. Marshal Hodges investigated but could find no clues. George still loved hunting, and one highlight happened in July when he bagged a 175-pound bear at Parker Island at the edge of the Everglades. He proudly mounted it upon his car and paraded it through Arcadia and all the way home. He left his hunting party to make their own way home. This was the Prime family about the summer of 1919. Amelia, or M.A. Prime, grandmother, born 1841. Kate Blount Prime, mother, born 1879. George Ballard Prime, father, born 1880. Anne or Annie Ballard Prime, daughter, born 1901. Catherine Amelia Prime, daughter, born 1903. George Ben Prime, Jr., son, born 1905. Rose Brooks Prime, daughter, born 1912. Alice Elizabeth Prime, daughter, born 1918. One of the big events that happened in Sarasota was when the Postal Service started offering home delivery of mail in 1920. The requirement to get mail delivered was an address and a home mailbox. Before this, everyone had to go to the post office to get their mail, either at the window or a post office box. This ad also announced a gas station at the store. In March, George sold his home on Gulfstream Avenue to J.B. Cousins of Philadelphia. He then bought the Hand property at Hudson Bayou, which included a house and 5 acres. After making some repairs, his family moved there, Sarasota Heights. In December, Prime resigned from the city council because he had moved out of the 3rd Ward. In April of 1921, the old Whitaker store, which George Prime had used in his earlier business life, was demolished to make room for a brick building. In July, he helped to get a regular scheduled steamboat for Sarasota through the Adams Boat Line. In August, he expanded his store building to the alley. George served as a county commissioner from 1922 to 1926. In April of 1923, Prime drove the proposed route for the Tampa to Miami Road with 20 other drivers to prove it could be done. When they didn't arrive in time, airplanes went out to search. Prime arrived in his Model T, completing the route, although many did not. In May, it looked like Prime was more than a merchant. He was also a farmer. He shipped 336 crates of celery on the railroad and received $3 per crate, or $1,008 for the carload. 1924 was the peak of Sarasota's real estate boom, and money was to be made by selling real estate. George Prime joined with his friend Frank Dillinger to get into real estate. George still ran his hardware store, but this was an additional source of income. In April of 1924, his mother, who was living with George and his family, passed away at age 83. From 1923 to 1924, Prime was the Sarasota County Commissioner's chairman. George was a director in the Bank of Sarasota. He was also a director in the First Bank and Trust Company, the Trust Company of Sarasota, and the American Mortgage and Guarantee Company. During the early morning hours of May 28, 1926, burglars ransacked the residence of George Prime on Orange Avenue at Prospect Street in Sarasota Heights and escaped with more than $3,000 in jewelry while residents of the house were sleeping. City Detective John Newman was called to the residence in the Heights yesterday morning by Mr. Prime, a county commissioner, who reported that during the night thieves had entered his house by first breaking through the screen door to the rear porch and obtaining from a pocketbook laying there a key to the front entrance. Apparently, the burglars were familiar with the residence and the fact that there was valuable jewelry inside as they went to the front of the house, unlocked the door, and made a systematic and quiet search of all the rooms. Entering the chamber of Miss Alice Prime, the burglars stole a diamond engagement ring and other jewelry. A valuable gold watch was taken from the bedchamber of Mr. Prime, in which he was sleeping at the time. Detective Newman reports that there were no clues as to who might have entered, but that not only were the burglars familiar with the premises, but it was evident that they were also well trained to their work. No amateur could have made such a clean job of it and gotten away without causing some disturbance, said the officer who was investigating the case. In June of 1926, George's 22-year-old daughter, Catherine, a schoolteacher, married W.G. Guy Shepherd, president of the Shepherd Lumber Company in Venice. George Prime opened a hardware store in the Valencia Hotel and Arcade on Venice Avenue, the building existing today. As you can see, the grand opening was on March 9, 1927, and the manager was E.A. Woods. The Valencia Hotel and Arcade, or the Post Office Arcade, on Venice Avenue, where George B. Prime Hardware resided in Venice. Today's Valencia Hotel and Arcade on Venice Avenue. Sometimes you don't find all the facts in the daily newspaper, but sometimes it shows up in the ads. This ad indicated that the GB Hardware Company moved to 6th Street, today's State Street, and Lemon Avenue. George went back to an animal theme for his advertising. The Prime family had a summer home in Clayton, Georgia, and in July 1927, the family spent some time there. While on this vacation, the Primes went to Hartford, Connecticut to visit relatives, his mother originating from Connecticut. GB Prime Hardware Company on 6th Street, now State Street, near Lemon Avenue. Present-day corner of State Street, which was 6th and Lemon Avenue. In September of 1927, Dillinger and Prime sold the Chevrolet building on the northwest corner of Orange and 6th, now State Street, which they owned for $50,000. The building occupied 100 feet on Orange Avenue and 100 feet on 6th Street. What you are looking at is a letterhead for the GB Prime Hardware Company, Incorporated. It indicates that Frank Dillinger was part owner and vice president of the firm. It also indicates that they controlled 2 stores, one in Sarasota and one in Venice. The manager of the Sarasota store was Charles A. Bunton. As the Florida real estate bust got worse, less and less ads were produced. The Trust Company of Sarasota, which George was a director, was on the corner of 6th Street and Pineapple Avenue. The building had previously been the Tiptoe Inn. George was still a director in the Bank of Sarasota in 1931. The bank closed its doors on August 29, 1932, the depositors receiving 42¼ cents on the dollar. As stated earlier, as the economy got worse, ads appeared less frequently. This one from December 1931 was right before Christmas. The hardware store was still at 6th and Lemon. By December 1937, George Prime was ready to retire from the business. This ad indicates he had changed the company name and had moved the store onto Upper Main Street. In 1938, the Primes moved to their summer home in Clayton, Georgia to retire. George passed away in 1953. In addition to what we have already covered in this biography, George B. Prime was a member of the Masonic Lodge, the Egypt Temple Shrine, and the Elks Lodge. Kate Blount Prime, besides marrying George and raising 5 children, was active in the community. Before her marriage to George, she was a school teacher. In September of 1921, Kate was elected local school trustee for 2 years, the first time a woman had held this position. The Sarasota Herald in October 1927 gives her this praise. Since the days of the Village Improvement Society, Mrs. George B. Prime has been actively identified with social and civic work in Sarasota. She is the president of the County Welfare Association, under whose auspices the county hospital was started. Although the Welfare Association has given the hospital to the city, the work of the association goes on afield. In January of 1930, the Sarasota Herald reported Kate's retirement. Announcement has just been made of the resignation of Mrs. George B. Prime as president of the County Welfare Association and superintendent of its relief work and charity cases. Mrs. Prime has been serving since last September as the Welfare Association's investigator and in charge of all dispensation of charity throughout the county without pay, these duties taking up her entire time. It finally became so arduous that she found it no longer possible to carry on, not that she was asking or expecting compensation for her work, but because of the fact that the association is without funds to carry on its activities. The organization having but $300 per month from the county to take care of its hospital cases alone, and with no funds available to carry on the distribution of food, clothing, and sick room supplies throughout the county during a period when demands have been most numerous and frequent. Mrs. Prime is the founder of the County Welfare Association, having organized it 8 years ago and given unsparingly of her time and energies. Her withdrawal as president and supervisor of charity cases will be felt keenly. There is no money available to hire a supervisor to take her place. Thank you for viewing George Prime's biography. I hope it was somewhat entertaining and that you learned a little bit more about early Sarasota.